can start.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to the first of our Google Hangouts. And I'm Dr. Michael Higgins. This is Dr. Petra Eckler. You'll know both of us hopefully from the videos in the first week. It's been great to see such a variety of participants, as I said in the email to you, taking part in the MOOC. It's been fantastic for us to look at all of your comments, and also it's been excellent for us to see the way that you've been discussing the MOOC with one another and answering each other's comments. We would like to be able to respond to more of the comments ourselves, and we are trying to respond to as many of them as we're able. But we're having to constantly catch up, so we're trying to respond to as many of the comments personally as we possibly can. But please forgive us if we're taking a little longer than you would like for us to respond to your comment. But it's great for us to read your comments, and we take a great interest in all of the things that you're telling us and all of the experiences that you're sharing with us. Now, Petra, you wanted to talk first of all. One of you highlighted a question about how to deal with an aggressive interviewee.
Yes.
Now, Petra, what would you like to say?
Yes, we had a question. How should journalists handle an interviewee who is verbally abusive towards them, and whether they should play on with that and expose the interviewee in their worst light, if that comes to it, or should they walk away? Well, I think first of all, it depends. As in many ways you would get an answer, it depends, because it really depends on the situation that you're in particular, and what you're trying to achieve out of that interview. And so, I would say, but it also, I think, being on the safe side and not getting into any physical confrontation is important. One thing you could do actually is, as long as the situation is not physically threatening and unsafe, you could continue with the interview, and you could record it, with a video camera or just with an audio camera, and then you can always go back to it later and decide of how much of that you want to use and whether you want to use it. I'm also thinking that if this is a case of public interest and of the public having to know this, then I would say you probably have bigger freedom to proceed. So, for example, if you're talking to a politician and they're being abusive towards you in your role as a journalist, this is a story of public interest, and because politicians are not supposed to act in this way. And so pushing that person's buttons and exposing them in their abusive ways is actually of great public interest, and something that maybe you may think about doing, because then the benefits of that would be much greater. What do you think, Michael?
I agree. You do have to principally look after your own physical well-being.
Yes.
Don't place yourself in danger. And as Petra was talking, a question came in. The risks involved these days of journalists covering war in the Arab world, and how it can be avoided, especially where there is danger of capture, kidnapping, and even beheading. And also journalists covering the Ebola scourge, where there are quite different dangers of catching the Ebola virus.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those of course are very, very different contexts, but
Yes.
But in each case, there's really no definitive advice that you can give a journalist in that context. Journalists need to be aware of the danger that they may be placing themselves in, and I personally would never take it upon myself to advise a journalist to place themselves in that kind of danger. But those journalists who do inevitably serve us all beyond the call of duty, and we can be very grateful to them. But I think your own physical safety always has to be paramount, in the context of the interview, but also in other contexts where you're doing your job.
I want to add to that I have a very good friend of mine from Uganda who used to be a journalist there, and he was actually a war correspondent. He has been to the Middle East, to the wars in former Yugoslavia when they were going on, to civil wars throughout the African continent. And we have talked about this very issue, and he has told me that actually he has been to a number of trainings done by non-profit organizations specifically targeted at journalists who are going into war-torn regions. And so he has been to almost a paramilitary or military training that teaches him how to, when he's in gunfire, what to do to protect himself, how to spot maybe roadside bombs and things that journalists practicing in peaceful environments would never think about, or don't need the training for that. So there are special courses and special organizations that offer such trainings for journalists who are going into those regions.
Of course, one of the platform, the technology innovations that's transformed the coverage of war has been social media. Going back to what we were saying a moment ago about many of the conflicts that are going on in the Arab world. The Arab Spring, for example, and the coverage of the Arab Spring was very much driven by social media. But thinking about social media in a different way, we've had a question that's just come in about the role of social media in researching and interviewing and how useful it is. I mean, you can think immediately of you can get sources now through social media. So much easier to find out who's interested in a topic and make contact with them just by running the hashtag through Twitter and seeing who's discussing it. Do you want to add anything?
Yes. So a lot of journalists in the UK, in America, in other countries, in Europe, and probably outside of Europe as well, are using Twitter and Facebook to source stories, which means to find people to interview for their stories. And and very often, but I want to caution also, in the media, we're very often in love with technology, and a new technology comes along and we all jump on it and we're very excited with the opportunities that it gives us. But sometimes it also robs us of opportunities, and I want to caution about that as well, because we have to be careful of who is on Twitter in the country that we're operating in. So even here in the UK, where Twitter is very popular, the uptake of Twitter among the regular population is not that high. So a lot of the people who are on Twitter are the media, politicians who are, that's part of their job. They're media pundits, so, experts. They're the most active and the most eager parts of the public who enjoy reading and commenting on content. But there's also a huge part of the population here that is not on Twitter, and many don't even know what Twitter is. And so if you're only sourcing your stories from the people available on Twitter, you're actually ignoring a big part of the population and some very good potential sources that could give a different angle to your story. And so I think we should still be mindful of the old-fashioned ways of doing reporting and interviewing, which is to hit the streets and to get out of the newsroom and to actually go and talk to real people face to face and not just through technology, because that would give us, I think the challenge now is going in that way, to be reminding, and we're constantly reminding our own students that, look, you can do great things on Twitter, but don't just focus on that. Actually go on the street and talk to some real people that way.
Of course, one of the great benefits of Twitter and social media generally is the expanded means for us all to express ourselves. And a few of you did give us questions on freedom of expression. CO Verus, well, first of all, asked us whether we would be covering guidelines on the law regulating journalism, and specifically on libel law. Now, we will be returning more to these matters. I will leave this hanging because we will be returning more to these matters in week 6 when Eamon O'Neill takes us through the norms of investigative journalism. But we won't be specifically covering libel laws, because libel laws differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And the libel laws in Britain are very different to those you would find in force in, for example, the United States. It happens that the libel laws in Britain tend to be quite prohibitive, I think it would be fair to say, against journalists, and they're very difficult to defend. But that's not that differs from country to country, and we are aware of the diversity of the participants. And so we will be talking about general principles involving maintaining truthfulness and not slandering anyone, but we won't be talking quite in specific terms about how libel relates to this specific legal jurisdiction. Another question that came from CEO was on our opinion on the GCHQ crackdown on the Guardian's coverage of the Edward Snowden leaks. Mm-hmm. And the GCHQ the Guardian agreed to destroy their hard drives in the presence of representatives of the British security services. It should be noted that was primarily a symbolic gesture, because the Guardian did acknowledge that they still had access to the contents of those files as they were stored overseas. So the only copies of those files that they were destroying were the copies that were held in the British premises. But nevertheless, I think that's a symbolic. I think that was as a symbolic gesture and as a symbolic moment. I think that's something that we should be concerned with. The second question relates to the treatment of Greg Greenwald's partner David Miranda under the Terrorism Act, where he was detained at Heathrow Airport. Yes. Again, for possessing I think it was USB drives with some of the documents leaked by Edward Snowden, which leads us on to, in the British context, the worrying use of the 2000 Terrorism Act against freedom of speech and against the press specifically. Now, the UK High Court described interpretation in Miranda's case as accepting that there is an indirect interference with freedom of the press in this case, but this should be weighed against the national interest. Now, as those who advocate journalistic freedom, we would argue that the weight should be with the freedom of the press to express themselves and to report the truth, rather than the national interest. But you can see that the courts and that the authorities are obliged to make that distinction. Now, in the context of the United Kingdom, press freedom is not a constitutional freedom of expression. It depends upon common law and the Human Rights Act in Europe, the European Convention, but that's subject to an expanding number of exceptions. Now, there are settings in which freedom of expression is guarded, the Education Act, for example. So we have relative freedom of expression in universities, and there are those who argue that that should be expanded to the press in the UK. But there are others who argue that the freedom of the press should correspond with freedom of the individual and all of our rights to express ourselves, and that this should be included in a constitution. So freedom of the press in the British case, and I suspect elsewhere, is something that we have to be constantly wary of. There are many who are arguing that the freedom of the press is at the moment being curtailed by the use of the terrorism legislation, and that's something that we do need to be concerned with and we need to be alert to. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, actually this relates to a question that we got that I noticed yesterday from Jean Berchmans Sibonio, who was saying that what can a journalist do if they're living in an area where freedom of expression is banned, and if they do have information that they want to publish, but if publishing that would risk their life? And again, this is a very serious question that it would depend on the situation that you're in, but we would strongly caution for safety first of all, and not risking your life for the publication of information, even though it isn't a public good. But we're not, every journalist who does this job needs to take their own risk assessment and be honest with themselves of how much risk they're willing to take in the jobs that they do. And some journalists are in much riskier and precarious positions than others. So that very much depends on the country that they're in and the situation that they're in. Very often in such countries there's a support network though for those journalists, and ways to maybe alleviate the burden of that risk. So maybe that's something to consider as well.
Martin O'Driscoll has asked, how do you keep your news story objective when your own feelings and those of many people you've spoken to are the same? In other words, I might agree with those I have interviewed, but our views may be incorrect based on the facts. You've done interviewing, Petya. What do you think?
Yes. Well, I think this is the case in such case, and in many others, you need to be careful of including more than one viewpoint in your news story. So you say you're working on a story and you have a certain opinion, and you end up, all your sources that you've included in the story are of that same opinion. it's good, first of all, that you've recognized that and you're cognizant of that. The next thing to do would be to go out and maybe go out of your way sometimes to find somebody who would bring in a different perspective and an opposing opinion. And so I know that sometimes this is seen as maybe too artificial of a balancing act. So, every time having to bring an opposing viewpoint. But on the other hand, while it may be seen as a little bit artificial, at least you're recognizing the fact that there are opposing opinions on this issue, maybe 2 or 3 different types of opinions. And so you are giving a chance to your audiences to consider that, look, although the predominant view here in this story is one, there are also other ways to think about this out there. And maybe in a follow-up story, there would be a chance to talk more and to frame the story more in terms of those opposing views.
Yes, I mean, for artificiality, we could rephrase that as professional practice. That as a journalist, you are effectively representing your readership. You're representing the public, and you have to assume that their views they represent a whole variety of views, and their views should be represented in the way that you cover the story. So you should attempt to disengage yourself as much as you possibly can from your own beliefs. That's very difficult to achieve, but it's one of the things that the good journalist strives to achieve. You disengage yourself from your views and ensure that spectrum of views that exists out there in the community that you're working on behalf of is adequately reflected. So even if you're not inclined to ask your interviewee that difficult question, which they may not have the good answer to, because you agree with them, it's your obligation as a good journalist to ask that difficult question, and also to have adequate knowledge of the subject matter to know what those most difficult questions are going to be.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the topic of objectivity is a very hot button issue in the area of journalism, both among academics like us, but also among news consumers and the media. And I have to say that I think that's also a very culturally specific issue. So in some countries, objectivity is a term that is very much ascribed to, and the media, the journalists practicing in some countries believe that that's one of their topmost jobs and task is to be objective, right? In other countries, other responsibilities come before objectivity. So you have to be try to be accurate and try to be all-encompassing before being objective. So objectivity sometimes is on top of the priorities of journalists, and sometimes later on in the middle maybe, and that's culturally, it depends on culture to culture. Right?
Well, I was going to ask you about that because you're from Bulgaria. You spent time in the United States.
Yes.
You now find yourself, much to your pleasure, here in Scotland.
Yes.
What's your impression of the cultural differences that you see in journalism? Everything from the application of news values to the way that we treat people in interviews. Do you see any significant differences?
Yes. Thank you for bringing the spotlight on me. So I was caught in the American tradition of doing journalism, which is, I would say, different from the British way of doing journalism. And objectivity is one of the very cardinal ways in which those two traditions are different. Journalism professors and practicing journalists in America, the majority of them, I'm not saying everybody, because of course there are differences of opinion, but the majority subscribe to the idea that the journalist needs to be objective and they need to represent all sides of a story, and that's of utmost importance. And that's something that is being taught at all levels of journalism programs, of esteemed journalism programs in the country. I think here objectivity is seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is a good thing, but not necessarily. There are other things that maybe are more important, and because here there are newspapers with media agenda, for example, right? And certain papers that have certain views, political and economic views on the world, and tend to publish things in a way that suit those views, which and we're free here to talk about this and to accept those media agendas from the media and to consume stories knowing that, okay, which is something that doesn't really. There's less of that in America, I think.
Well, this is a debate, of course, that we could have. I mean, in the British context, impartiality, as we would rather call it, rather than objectivity, although it's driven by the same desire to produce news that's committed to giving a balanced and truthful view. Impartiality is secured in terrestrial television by the public service arrangement. So, and terrestrial broadcast news in this country is obliged to demonstrate impartiality. In the newspapers, you're quite right, we have a tradition of partisanship amongst newspapers, that many newspapers, almost the majority of newspapers, advocate specific political parties. Many have always advocated parties, others change as they go along. And under a perspective that we could suppose call the liberal, and it has been known as the liberal perspective, all of those newspapers are making their own contribution to a kind of a broad public discussion. So provided there are newspapers that offer a range of views, then that kind of partisanship is absolutely fine. But you're quite right, in terms of the way they cover certain issues, and politics specifically, newspapers don't always feel, in Britain anyway, don't always feel that need for need to be objective or to be impartial. And there are some of us, myself included, who regret that, and they would prefer to see a more balanced perspective in some newspapers. But having said that, there is a lot of very, very high quality political journalism that goes on in the United Kingdom, and a great deal of it plays against very often the political leanings of the newspaper. So you can go to newspapers that support the Conservative Party in the British context, but you will still find stories which criticise Conservative politicians along with every other politician. So although these newspapers are aligned with political parties, journalists are mischievous creatures, and journalists are more committed to their own professional practices quite properly than they are to the agenda of their newspapers very often. So you will often find that journalists will produce copy that perhaps isn't altogether in keeping with their paper.
And I think a benefit of that also is that once you declare your own, the fact that you're not necessarily impartial, you kind of are free from that, are free from the idea that you have to be, okay? So you're free to pursue an idea and a logic and a line of reporting that otherwise maybe you would not be able to because you have to stay impartial. I want to turn your attention to, so we had earlier on a question to our Twitter feed from Gabrielle North, and she was asking, what do you mean, Dr. Eckler, what do you mean by conflict tragedy typically being dynamic to report? So this is something I said in the video on news values. And actually one of you explained it very well underneath when this question was asked also in the comments. So what I meant by conflict and tragedy being dynamic is that they are typically fast developing. So those stories are typically breaking stories. First of all, they're hard news stories, okay? And they're immediate, and they're developing typically as the journalists start reporting on them. So they always start with a lot of unknowns, and then journalists uncover things as they go. So that creates a much more fast-paced environment to work in, a much more dynamic environment. While soft news, for example, typically when journalists go into a soft news story, they know everything that is going to happen in that situation. Okay, there are fewer surprises than there are in those conflict and tragedy types of scenarios that I was describing.
We've got a couple of questions, but one from Becky D concerns the moral consequences of upsetting our family and friends by putting ourselves in places of danger, and also in the event that we are, for example, captured and held hostage, that others may have to imperil their own lives to come and save us, and whether that is whether it's moral to do that. Well, I think that's a moral quandary. I think you have to weigh the importance of covering the conflict of the situation that you've gone to, with the dangers that you're putting yourself in, but also the dangers that you're putting other people in. I mean, one of the things that we return to again and again is the importance of judgment in journalism, and exercising good judgment, and ensuring that your judgment is an informed one that takes account of all of these circumstances. So journalists certainly do need to be mindful of these circumstances. Um,
Absolutely, yes.
Another question that came in, and I apologise I didn't write down the name of the person, but thank you for giving the question, was to do with the use value of cultural proximity in a multicultural environment. I mean, we speak to you from Scotland. You might have recognised the accent. We're speaking to you from Scotland, which is an increasingly multicultural country, which is something that we are very proud of. One of the implications of that is that you are speaking to an increasingly diverse audience. But the news value of cultural proximity always assumes that the audience think about, the audience have common interests that perhaps they don't have. Is that a danger?
What do you mean?
Well, they do think that in discharging the news value of cultural proximity, there's a danger that journalists may be speaking only to part of their audience and may be excluding many others.
Yes, I mean, yes, absolutely. That's always the danger. But I also want to caution against trying to be all-inclusive in the stories that we write, because you can never, with a single story, interest every single person from your readers. Different people have different interests. Some care about politics, others care about economics, others care about cats and dogs, and not a bit about politics or economics. And so I don't think there is a story, maybe except for the Scottish referendum, that interested every single person in Scotland. Okay, I don't think there are many such stories that everybody would be equally interested in. And so, I think in this case, because we are such a diverse country, and a lot of the countries that our audiences are coming from are very culturally diverse, I think it may be a better option to write a story that is truthful and maybe has cultural relevance to some, but not all of the audiences. Because by trying to be relevant to everybody, you're ultimately diluting your content, and you're trying to fit too many shoes, and you cannot possibly do that. But actually, this question about the proximity relates to a question that several of you posted when we talked about the news values, and it had to do with the Ebola virus.
Can I come in just before you say that?
Yes.
I agree with what you say, but I do think the news is an opportunity. Journalism is an opportunity to reach out and include people who haven't felt included. So so I absolutely agree that that we shouldn't try to be all things to all people. But I think that including those who feel marginalised is one of the core duties of the diligent journalist.
Yes, absolutely.
Like the Ebola virus.
Yes, like the Ebola virus. So the questions about the Ebola virus came up actually when we were talking about impact as one of the news values. So I was saying in the video that impact is the number of people who are affected by something, by an issue, and stories with higher impact, so issues affecting more people, are seen as more newsworthy. And so naturally, it was very logical of a lot of you to ask the question of why then is there so little coverage of the Ebola virus, which has killed, I think, close to 3,000 people already in Africa. So a high impact story, yet a lot of people feel that there's very little coverage of that in America, in the UK, in Western media. And I think one of the reasons for that is another news value, and that's exactly proximity. Because up until very recently, this epidemic and this tragedy was in Africa alone, and it was quarantined almost there, and it had not yet spilled into Great Britain or into America. And so it was still on the pages of the more or less international news pages. It was still seen as an international news story because it was distant from the local audiences. The moment the one American in, was it Dallas, got sick?
Yes.
And I think a person here in Great Britain has been sick. The moment that started to spill into the US and the UK, this is now becoming a national story and not an international one. So the issue of proximity here is, I think, what will drive the higher coverage of this issue, as now, the risk factor for people living in these countries is much higher than it was before.
A few raised in the questions the issue of emotionality in news. I mean, one of the and a number of people have pointed out, why is it that bad news always bad news stories always get. And
Yes.
and it's one of the reasons for that is that it makes us slightly fearful, or bad news inspires the emotions, and there is a there is a feeling among many journalists and many who look at journalism and many who consume journalism that journalism is moving much more towards accentuating emotionality and speaking to the emotions. And we'll be looking later in the we can discuss later in the course, but there's much more, especially often in conflict coverage, much more of an opportunity to speak to the camera from war zones, and the technology enables us to do this. And these are very often very emotional addresses that journalists give, because they're speaking from situations in which where they're surrounded by human tragedy. And there's no way that you can describe human tragedy to a camera effectively without expressing the emotionality that surrounds you, expressing your response to that, and also, of course, tapping into to the emotions that the audience at home are likely to be feeling. But I just wonder, many people are wondering whether this shift towards emotionality is perhaps leading into too much other news coverage that perhaps it should be kept apart from. I mean, an example I can think of is that there is a feeling now that more of our understanding of important issues and important people is driven by whether or not we like someone and whether or not we have an emotional attachment to them. I mean, do you have any thoughts on emotionality? Do you think it's a good thing?
Well, there is actually, speaking more from my experience with research, emotional stories are good stories, okay? So journalists are storytellers. If you base a story solely on fact without any, color from quotes or from real people, or without any, if you just base it on facts and numbers, it's useful, it's good, but how many people are going to read it? It's kind of like the broccoli that you're trying to serve to kids. So journalists are trying to pepper that with emotions and with quotes and with color in a way that, as many of you have pointed out, they would get people to read those stories. Okay, and so there has been research done on this, that emotions drive people to read things, to attune to messages. They make communication more persuasive. Emotional communication is a more persuasive type of communication, and so it's part of good storytelling. Are we taking that to the extreme sometimes? Yes, definitely. And some media outlets are much worse in doing that than others, and are exploitive of people's emotions, to be frank. But so I think in making those judgments, again, you have to consider, what is the point of the story and what is the public good that will come out of this story, and to consider the repercussions of maybe going too much down the emotional route versus staying a little bit more grounded and, again, impartial to some of this.
And I can now give proper credit to one of the people who highlighted emotionality, because Christy Zacharias coming back actually to the interviews that we discussed earlier, spoke about
Zacharias, yes.
Zacharias, I do beg your pardon. Spoke about reducing the context of tears in an interview. Yes. It's uncomfortable to watch.
Yes.
Can be uncomfortable to take part in. How are those something to be wary of?
So this was Christy Zacharias was discussing the interview, the video from Liz Brody, who is the editor at large at Glamour, who did a story on a family involved in prostitution for five generations, and the child abuse that went into that, and a very touching, a very emotional story. And she mentioned, Liz Brody, that the women were crying as they were telling their stories, and so Christy was asking whether that made the story more or less newsworthy, and why the journalist shared that at all. I think the journalist shared that just as a way to let us imagine what the interviewing situation was. I don't think she was led to be more or less intrigued by the story of those women had they not cried, because she already knew what the story was, and she was already interested enough in that story. And so I think that was just a detail that she shared as a way of us to imagine the situation that everybody was in as those details were coming out. But there were definitely concerns about maybe the exploitative nature of such stories, especially when being sold by high-profile, glitzy magazines like Glamour, for example. One person, I cannot find their name, asked if people got paid for this story. I do not know this for sure, and I have not asked Liz Brody this question, but I can. So Catriona Murray said no specific mention of who's getting paid what. In the American context of where this magazine is based, sources do not get paid for stories. Okay, and that is actually very explicit in most newsrooms. That's a rule of conduct that no journalist dares to breach. Okay, that's different in different countries. Okay, this is specific for the United States where this magazine is based, and because of that, I highly doubt that they were getting paid for that story. Frankly.
We do have amongst some of the popular papers what's known as checkbook journalism, but this there are some who would contest this, but this has diminished in recent years, in large part because predominated in Sunday morning tabloid newspapers. The public appetite is shifting, I think. In this country we've had the phone hacking scandal, and there have been a number of controversies that have arisen around journalistic practices at the edge, and I don't think that the checkbook journalism has quite the force that it used to have. Adrian Brewster, I said we shouldn't be trying to find a job as a journalist necessarily. We should just learn basic research, interview, story writing skills and legalities, and do it in your own local community blog. Well, a large part, of course, this is what we are. This is what we are trying to help. The one thing I would say is, of course, that there will continue to be journalists and continue to be major news organisations. And if you do the job well, and if you have personal integrity and you have a commitment to truth, then you should be one of the people who are doing this. So please, if you, by all means, and we would encourage everyone to get involved with reporting what's going on in your local community. We have now these platforms. We've had them for many years, of course, but we have digital platforms that enable us to do this, and so make the fullest use of those. But if you find your talents are in that direction, we would recommend that you do get into the media. There are many good journalists, but we always need more. So don't give up. If you're good at this, and if you have the right, and if you have the qualities and the integrity, then please do seek a job as a journalist.
And I want to add to that, we haven't specifically talked about citizen journalism, but as Michael pointed out, there are plenty of platforms where regular citizens can do their own reporting and write their own stories. And being outside of the confines of a professional newsroom, they're actually free to express their opinions, and they have more freedom, basically, to say what they want and to dig out stories that maybe wouldn't make it into the official newspapers of their countries. And very often in this country and in many others, stories sometimes are driven to the forefront and come to the attention of the larger audiences from citizen journalists, because they're the ones that are on the, they're in the background, they're on the ground, basically the foot soldiers that live some of these issues every day. So who's better to tell those stories than the people involved in them on a daily basis?
And on that note, look forward to reading more of your comments, and we'll see you at the next Hangout. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.